Very simple question for our surgeon. Um, Fascinated to see what goes on when we're unconscious. But I was interested in the fluorescence. What exactly is fluorescing?
It's ICG, so it's the blood vessels, basically. So what happens is the anaesthetist injects the ICG, and then it will, there's a particular light frequency that we have inside. It's called Firefly. It's proprietary technology, but it will then send energy into the blood, which is now carrying ICG, and that's reflected back out, and then the frequency is captured. So in that case, it's only the blood vessels. I think it was very obvious to everyone where the tumour was, but the reason that I'm starting to use it is that for some of the tumours that aren't quite so pedunculated, there is some evidence that it might be able to define the margin clearly because there's more blood vessels in the tumour. Now that's quite crude, but there are lots of moves to have tumour-specific molecules that can fluoresce, and that's one of the things that we're interested in the Royal Marsden and in other centres of doing, so that we could have, you know, a GIST-specific marker that will clearly define the resection margin at the time of surgery, but also I think define where the metastatic disease is, and perhaps in the more advanced cases allow us to confirm at the time of surgery whether we need to take other organs.
Thank you. You mentioned ICG. That stands for something.
Yeah, I'm being recorded now. It's indocyanine green. So it's also used it's a dye, but it fluoresces back. I won't go into the chemistry of it right now, but yeah.
Hi. I was diagnosed with GIST in 2012 when I had a massive bleed. They removed 5 tumours from the small bowel. I was in imatinib for 3 years, and then they stopped taking them. They said I couldn't. They would stop working, and because I was stable anyway. That's when I said, fine, that's okay. I've been having regular screenings, MRI and CT scans every 3 months. Last year, I had a referral to Dr. Falk in Bristol as a second opinion, and he arranged for me to have a PET scan, which I did, and there was a hot spot on there. In Bristol, I'm actually, my oncologist is in Musgrove in Taunton, by the way, Dr. Cattell, but she referred me to Bristol to see the specialist up there. They wanted to actually remove, the hotspot. Went for my pre-assessment, everything, and then I failed the fitness test.
Right.
And surgery is just a no-go. I'm too much of a high risk. Now, obviously, it upset me because I thought I was going to get this tumour out, but because of the high risk, they wouldn't do it. I've got another PET scan due on this coming Monday in Musgrove, and I was just wondering if that robotic surgery would be an option if it's grown again, if it's...
Well, I think that the fitness for surgery is a different thing. And I think that if someone's not fit enough for surgery, then it's the wrong thing, because you have to individualize the treatment. But what I would say is in settings like that, there are other treatments, further systemic treatment or ablative treatments, either with radiotherapy or radiofrequency ablation. So there's other techniques which are just as good, to be honest, for metastatic disease. So I think you could be considered for one of those. But just because you don't have surgery, surgery isn't the be all and end all. Really, I think, Mike and the guys can confirm it, the surgery is helpful, but how you get on is determined by response to your drug treatment and the tumour itself, and it sounds like you've got quite good biology, even though it's come back. Mike, what you would...
Because I have neurofibromatosis as well, that was a bit of a high risk, they said, in case Dr. Falk said the neurofibros into sarcoma.
They can do, but you can also have hotspots with neurofibromatosis that are actually benign tumours as well.
Yeah. Did either of you guys want to comment on? Okay.
Can I just, the only one thing to add is that sometimes, as we all discussed, I think, you don't necessarily need to do something. So you have a PET scan, which shows that things are almost exactly the same as last time. It's only very legitimate to keep an eye on things, because there is such disease, not just in chicks, but in other tumor types as well, that, waiting is the way forward, especially when anything else might be more high risk. So you have to see what the results show.
Hi, I have a question for Miles from our Facebook page. Would these new techniques allow retention of part of the stomach to create a pouch for those with tumours found on the gastroesophageal junction?
It depends where it is. I think if it's on the OG junction, I think that the best operation for that would be an esophageal gastrectomy. There have been lots of different types of operations where you either interpose some bowel between the distal stomach and the top, or you just take that area out. But I think functionally, my bias would be that person should have, for tumours in that area, that you should have that area removed. And that actually your function at 1 year would be better with an esophageal gastrectomy. So the answer is you could definitely put pouches there, but they're not always so good. They're not always so functional. And I think that when you're doing gastric surgery, you have to be very mindful of that. Mr. Mudan used to do a procedure called the Merendino procedure, which worked very well for him, where he would put a kind of graft in of small bowel. I don't do that procedure myself. It's very technical. But I'm always mindful of the function, so I would remove the area. And the robot, it might actually be a bit more difficult to do that robotically than open. So I don't think it'll give you any extra benefits in that regard. But what minimally invasive surgery does is it lessens the impact on the patient and hopefully can get you back to treatment and back on your imatinib quicker.
Thank you. I have 3 questions. The first is, I was in a medical diagnostics firm recently called SynLab and picked up a brochure on liquid biopsy, and sure enough, mentioned was GIST. And I wondered when liquid biopsy for GIST was useful, and how accurate they are. The second question is about...
So does everybody know what a liquid biopsy is? That's a really interesting new kind of technology that we're all very excited about. So this is where you don't actually have to have a needle take tissue in order to make a diagnosis. We can make a diagnosis from a blood test. And this has really been one of the holy grails of oncology for many years. If we could do a blood test to detect cancer, that would be absolutely fabulous. And the technology is being developed. There are a variety of ways of doing it. You can extract from blood sometimes whole cancer cells if you have markers on the cancer cell surface to be able to do that. Or you can get fragments of the DNA, that's the genes, if you know what to look for. Or you can even sometimes get fragments of the RNA, which produces the protein, which is probably even the best thing to do. So all of these various techniques are looking for molecules within a blood test that tell you that there is a cancer cell present somewhere in the body. So this is extremely exciting technology, and there are a number of places around the world eagerly trying to develop this as diagnostic services for clinical use. They're not currently available for clinical use. There's going to be probably quite a lot of testing that we need to do to be able to establish how sensitive and how specific they are. But absolutely, this is going to be one of the technologies that's coming around the corner. And how is this going to change what we do as oncologists and surgeons? It's really going to make a big difference, I think, because one of the things that everybody wants to know when they've had an operation, like we've just seen, a fabulous operation, is, am I cured, right? And when you go back to the surgeon, Well, they often say, oh yes, I took everything. And then you go along to the oncologist and they say, well, it's not quite as simple as that. Maybe there was some microscopic metastatic disease, which we won't be able to see on a CT scan, and currently blood tests don't tell us. But this kind of technology might be the answer, so that you can have a much greater assurance that you have actually been cured of the cancer. And this would mean, for example, that you don't have to take imatinib for 3 years. Because if you're cured of the GIST, then we don't have to give you the treatment. And that would be great for everybody. So this would be a revolutionary technology. It would save us a lot of money, although, as you know, imatinib is going to be cheap as chips next year. So it won't save us that much money, but it will save us some money. It'll save a huge amount of anxiety. And it's going to be, I would say it's probably going to be the next big thing in cancer care is liquid biopsy, and it's just around the corner.
What's your best guess of when that might be available?
I think we're going to see some cancers. It will be introduced within the next couple of years, and GIST may be one of the earlier ones because, as you all know, there is a molecular lesion in GIST, which means it's very easy to detect genes from GIST tumor cells in blood. If you know what the mutation is, then you can go and look for it with highly specific probes. So GIST, although it's not going to account for a lot of cancer patients, again, maybe at the front of the queue with a technology change. So we were at the front of the queue with targeted therapy, completely revolutionized the way a lot of oncology systemic therapy is given, and I think this may be another thing where GIST patients will be at the front of the queue for a technology change.
Thank you. Your cheapest chips remark queued up my next question, which is about generics, imatinib generics. What is the status of these days, their clinical efficacy and their availability?
Well, generic imatinib is imatinib. It's the same molecule, just in a different package from a different company. So it should be absolutely the same efficacy. There is a patent issue in this country. As you know, we have to protect the economic and the intellectual property rights of the companies that do the development to get these drugs into market. And we're in this very interesting situation at the moment with imatinib, where Novartis still have the patent for treatment of GIST, but they've lost the patent for treatment for chronic myeloid leukemia, which was the initial disease that they developed imatinib for. So we are now allowed to use generic imatinib to prescribe for patients with chronic myeloid leukemia, but we are still supposed to be, and at the Christie Hospital we do, I absolutely promise you, provide Novartis Gleevec for patients with GIST. Our pharmacists. And we have to be careful about this, because if we were to play rough and ready with the pharma industry, it would not be good for us. So yes, no, we do the right thing. So yes, it's generic imatinib is available and is being used for patients with chronic myeloid leukemia. I think for GIST, I don't want to say on camera exactly when it's due, but it's almost coming off patent.
Thank you. And the third question you just queued up as well, which is that since we GISTers are not so numerous, but there are more people with leukemia, is there anything going on in the leukemia area that we should take note of for GIST, for the treatment of GIST?
I'm not a hematologist, so I'm probably not the best person to answer this, but GIST and CML treatments have been kind of interacting with each other. Some of you might have been involved, for example, in trials of nilotinib, which was the second generation tyrosine kinase inhibitor that Novartis produced. Didn't seem to be that helpful for patients with GIST, but is a now standard therapy for CML. And there are other drugs that the hematologists have tried out, some of which have turned out to be useful for GIST as well, because the molecule that we are targeting in GIST is not the same as in CML. It's very similar. It's in what we call the same family, but it is not the same molecule. So in GIST, the target, as you probably all know, is called KIT, or in some patients it's platelet-derived growth factor receptor, or PDGFR, whereas in chronic myeloid leukemia, the target is the Abelson tyrosine kinase, or ABL. So they're different, and therefore the treatment pathways are slightly different, and it is a completely different disease. Obviously, CML is a disease of bone marrow. GIST is a solid tumour of the GI tract. They're, you know, as far apart as you can imagine, really, aren't they?
Okay, thank you. A question for Dr. Spiros. With regard to your talk on trials, how do people get on trials?
Well,
An open question.
it is. As I briefly tried to discuss, the trials at different phases. Drugs that have already been proven to be safe, and there's a dose established after the first phase 1 trials, and going to bigger trials, phase 2 or phase 3. These are available in centres certainly across the UK. Different centres have different trials that are open, so usually the way to find out about them is, if somebody's a sarcoma specialist, they'll probably know what's available around, and certainly sometimes asking a second opinion from a bigger centre can help if they are not aware of those. What is a bit more difficult is when it comes to the phase 1 trials, the ones I was talking to you about earlier, where these are even more specialized, and you can find them in only specific units, which are called phase 1 units or drug development units. And there are quite a few of these around the country. And again, usually it'd be a sarcoma specialist that would be, first of all, aware of the phase 2 or 3 trials that are running, because these would come first. And then if there isn't anything available, either as a standard treatment or a trial of that setting, then a referral to the appropriate drug development unit for such a trial. So I know this doesn't sound very simple, but really, because there are centres that do specialise in the treatment of GIST and other sarcomas, it would be via them that you'd find the appropriate trial. And also, it would also be them that would have an idea about whether some trials are not available in their unit, but they're elsewhere around the country, and sometimes even elsewhere in the world, although there's obviously issues with that.
The reason I ask the question is because people in this room that may be correct for a trial may be in that slightly odd situation where their oncologist might not know that there is a trial for whatever reason. So they'll go back to their oncologist and say, we've just heard that there might be a trial for something that I might be interested in going. Is that acceptable to do that? We would encourage that. So
I think the answer is definitely yes, and in fact, even if it's driven from the patient or driven from their oncologist, if they're aware of something else, then they should certainly ask for such an opinion. But even if they're not, if they know there's another centre that they've got, trials happening, it's certainly the way forward to ask for such an opinion. And there are lots of patients that I've met that in fact ask more than a second opinion. They've got a third and a fourth, and they will go around either sarcoma units or even phase 1 units and see what's available. And especially with the early clinical trials, it isn't simply a matter of whether a trial is open. Sometimes the trial is available, but there aren't treatment slots, because such trials only would include patients at a very small number, treat them, see if the drug is safe, see if the dose that they're trying is safe, and then expand. So sometimes there's a trial that's running and there aren't any slots in one center and they are in another. Yeah. So that's another reason to look for those. The issues always have to do, and that's something that we often don't talk about, is the reality of it. If you want to have treatment and be seen somewhere, let's say weekly, you have to be able to get there. It has to do with cost, with motivation, with fitness. So there are many issues. It isn't as simple as saying I will travel 100 miles in order to get to one centre every week.
Yeah, I accept that, but it's about the opportunity. So, be brave, people in the room that maybe think that they ought to mention to their oncologist, if it's not already been mentioned to them, about trials. Go and see them and say, look, can I be considered for it at least? Questions?
It's probably a really silly question, but sorry. Is the Royal Marsden the only place that has the robotics?
No, it's not. I think it's just we're lucky enough to be in a unit and an institution that's supported us to develop the service. And over the last 2 years, Asif Chowdhury and I have developed esophageal gastric surgery. And I think we're just a little bit ahead of the curve. I think there are certainly other centres who are developing robotic esophageal surgery. And with regard to the GIST, it's just we've got a very large sarcoma unit. We have people like myself who have trained specifically in minimally invasive and robotic surgery, so it just all kind of came together. But I think that the game changer for robotics is actually the new iteration of the technology is very, very good. So, I mean, the first iPhone came out was okay. It took about the third or fourth one, to be really very, very, to have all the functionality. And I think that the staplers and the fact that we can do things like move the table together with the robot, and you can get access to all of the areas with the new technology, mean that I think in the future a lot of these procedures will be done. I think we're just a little bit ahead of the curve. It's not all rosy either. It's quite difficult to do it, and we are on a learning curve. I think it will take a while to be developed, but I would agree that in time, I would say that things like straightforward gastric GISTs will be done robotically. Certainly, they're usually done minimally invasively now. So we're just kind of ahead of the curve.
Okay, and my other question was, can you explain to me what is it periorbital edema is, please?
It's swelling of the eyes, just around the eyes, just gets swollen eyes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Do they do robotic surgery for backs?
In view of what Mr. Smith was saying, about GIST patients being more likely to have secondary cancers afterwards or different cancers, is there a case for monitoring GIST patients that are supposed to be cured, perhaps for the rest of their lives, even if it's by blood test?
So I think that some of the reasons you find other cancers is because GIST patients have scans. And I think that that was work that I did in Toronto, and really the point we wanted to get across to people was just don't forget to have your colon screening. That's really what it is. So we do think that there's a slightly higher incidence of second cancers in GIST. So some of the time, that's also because when someone's diagnosed with, for example, a colonic cancer, as part of the scan, you identify small innocuous GISTs, or you identify ones that do need treatment. But really what we were trying to say is, just because you've had one cancer, don't forget about other ones. And if you have heard that there's an incident or that there's a higher rate of second cancers, there might be, but just be mindful that colon cancers and renal cancers might have a slightly higher incidence. And that's for us as doctors to keep an eye on the other organs when we do a CT scan, and also for you guys to make sure to get your colon screened. Is that fair enough, Mike? Or?
Yes, absolutely. I've got one patient who presented with 3 tumours all at once: a kidney cancer, a colon cancer, and a GIST. Have you got one of those? He's doing really well.
No, but that is exactly what our big analysis found, that it was renal cancers and colon cancers and GISTs together. So kind of, that's nice.
I had a question about new research into GIST, and I was just wondering how successful kind of the sites are in the UK at attracting new research trials into GIST, international trials.
So I think at the moment there is a lot of interest in research in GIST, and some of these trials, well, most of these didn't exist a few years ago. So now the majority of the large centers are trying to incorporate them in the daily practice. It's always easier when you've got an established a drug that is in a phase 2 or 3 stage, because you can sort of easily be part of that if you've got a unit that's involved in research. Phase 1 is a lot more complicated because normally you need a dedicated unit, though sometimes it can be incorporated as part of a sarcoma team. So as I was saying earlier, this is one of the reasons why it's usually a smaller number of centers that will offer those. And they do tend to recruit very well. Often, although when we discussed it briefly earlier, you thought that sometimes location is not an issue, this can become a problem, because let's not forget that the commitment that needs to be put into a trial is quite large. And although in principle one would say, well, of course I would do anything, quality of life and everything else that comes with frequent visits and having a new treatment, especially with unknowns, is not that simple. But GIST patients overall are very well, and even when they've progressed through treatments, they remain quite well because of the surveillance that they undergo. So they are often very good trial candidates when it comes to getting into a trial, and because of the commitment and the fitness, you know, the trials recruit quite well, especially when there are targets for them.
Very often there will be a possibility of getting reimbursement for travel expenses from the pharma company sponsoring that trial. So
No, that's true.
It's worth asking.
It's just that money is only one part of it.
Well, yes, of course, yeah.
The other thing to add, and we'll give a brief update on trials that GIST Support UK are involved in as well, is the laboratory-based trials, for example, or research, shall I say, not trials, research. So, you know, we have a medical advisory board, of which we have some members here, who will have a look at, you know, if somebody comes to us and says, I'm looking to do some research into GIST, they get to look at it and say whether or not they think it's a good idea for it to go ahead. They send it out to Europe and America possibly, and then if we've got the money to be able to support that, then we will. So, you know, we're doing our bit, and the fundraising that a lot of you guys in the room have done have helped in order to us to have the money in order to do these trials, so these research grants. So that's the other arm of it. Did you want to say?
Yeah, I think Smaris is underplaying how difficult it is to do clinical research in anything, and the team at the Marsden is absolutely brilliant. Your question was really, is it any more difficult in the UK than another country, and are we a good place for the pharma companies to come and do research? And there are good things about this country in terms of doing clinical research, and particularly in terms of rare cancer, because patients are very well centralised within the NHS, and we do have a small number of teams treating rare cancer patients. So that brings the right patient together. But you need a significant infrastructure at your centre to be able to do any kind of research, which is really very expensive. And that is not easy to set up and keep running, and it requires a lot of funding. So the team down at the Marsden are doing a great job in making it look effortless. And they absolutely need your support. So we all absolutely require third sector income, because otherwise we end up simply being the tail being wagged by the pharma company, you know, dog, don't we? Otherwise we're doing the research that they want us to do rather than doing research that we think you guys need. So academic research doesn't get funded by pharma. The only way in this country we really get any money for academic research is through donations. So in America, there is central funding of that kind of research. Generally speaking, that doesn't happen in the UK. So we have funding that comes in through Cancer Research UK and through organisations like GIST Support UK and Sarcoma UK, which are absolutely essential to keeping the research infrastructure in these units. So a big thank you to all of you. If you've done any fundraising or given any money yourselves, it's absolutely necessary. Thank you.
Following on from that, the Prime Minister mentioned the other day in her speech that there would be more money through the NHS for diagnosis and detection. And obviously for GIST, so many of us present too late in the day through emergency operations, so that we do have metastasis by the time it's removed. Is there any hope of some of that money reaching research for GIST, do we think? And if so, where would that money best be spent? Is it through the blood test that you talked about earlier, Mike?
No, I don't think so. No, I think what she's talking about is increased access to radiology. This country is known to be under-scanned compared to other European countries. So I imagine, there has been a big push to get more scanners into the country and more radiologists. So that's probably where that money is going. And we really do need it. We're still not up to the same number of scanners per head of population than other European countries, and that may account for why it appears that our cancer outcomes are not as good as other countries in Europe.
I've got 3 questions. First is very easy. Can we have a list of these centres that do phase 1, 2 and 3 trials, please? I'm sure that can be provided, because when patients are in a situation where they've run out of the standard options, they will then know where their nearest appropriate centre is. Is that feasible?
Isn't it already available, Judith?
Not in that detail, I don't think. Not the centres, you know.
I think that's something for you guys to sort out on your website, because that's publicly available information.
Okay, right, that's the first thing. Second thing is, I've developed an allergy to the contrast medium for CT scans. I've never heard of anybody else who's got this problem. Does it mean...
Hands up here who's got contrast allergy. One. Yeah, somebody else. Yeah, it's not that uncommon.
Okay. Does that mean you can't have a PET scan?
That's an interesting question. When we do PET, we usually do a CT at the same time. So it would probably reduce the information that you would get from a CT PET scan. The isotope, the FDG, the isotope that is given, the radioactive sugar, is not part of your allergy, so you could have that. And you would get some imaging from that. And they would do a non-contrast CT probably at the same time, which would help, but it would be a bit less than what you would get if it was a contrast CT with a PET scan.
Right. And my third question, which is the elephant in the room, I suspect, that we've all been avoiding, is these trials are often pan-European. What's going to happen after Brexit? Does anybody know?
Well, we've got an Irishman. Here's a pan-European. Anyway, moving on. The elephant remains. I think the answer to that is we don't know.
I think we don't know, but I just want to reassure people that it's obviously something that's on the horizon and we're thinking about. So I know that nationally and individually, we are all taking these things into account. I can't speak directly to what's happening with trials, but everybody is actively working out solutions to try and keep everything smooth, and that patients will be treated and that surgery will keep going and the show will be on the road.
What would be a really good idea would be something like, I don't know, a common rule book or something like that. I think that's what we're thinking about.
Okay, next question.
Could I ask what your thoughts are if you have a low risk GIST, that it's important to know your mutations?
I think,
and mitotic count, I'll add to that.
I think if you mean if you've had one taken out, I think the answer is no, because I think if it's a high risk, then you would want to look for the treatment with imatinib. But if I've taken out a low risk GIST, then the standard treatment is a CT scan in 1 year, and the likelihood you can very accurately classify, predict the risk of recurrence. So there's no need to do that, because the likelihood is that you're cured. Not completely, and actually I do want to say Mike is absolutely right. If people do have advanced GISTs, I will always, ahead of time, we will have a plan and say that the tumour is removed, but you may need further treatment afterwards. Or in a case of someone who has a low risk or very low risk GIST, say the likelihood is that you will not. But I certainly don't tell people that they're completely cured, and nor should you.
Did I understand you to say that the robotic surgery may be more suitable for people with esophageal GIST?
Well, I think you can perform an esophagectomy robotically, and yes, we have looked at some patients with OGJ or OGJ tumors for appropriateness for the technique. And basically the robotic esophagectomy is an Ivor Lewis esophagectomy, and it requires 2 surgeons, one at the table and one at the console. And I think, yes, at the moment we are assessing. My colleague Asif Chowdhury is an OG surgeon, and we assess the patients to see would they be suitable. But I think that there's a small subset of patients that that a robotic approach is appropriate for, and I think that certainly we would consider all members or all comers for whether they should have robotic surgery or not. But sometimes with the GIST, the problem with the robot is you don't have tactile feedback. And if you've got a big tumor or you've got a cystic one or one that looks friable, that's another contraindication. And I think in the rectum, and I think up high as well, you have to be very, very careful about the robot because you don't want to rupture the tumor. So the answer is, if people have soft tissue tumors around the OGJ, whether that be a leiomyoma, a GIST or other tumor, yes, if I see the patient, I will discuss with Asif whether we think that's appropriate, but it may not be appropriate for all people, and it's just a small subset of people. The most important thing is you get the right surgery. It doesn't matter if it's open, it doesn't matter if it's laparoscopic, the tumor comes out safely. That's the best thing to have. It's great if you can have it robotically or laparoscopically, but you can't be wedded to the method. The important thing is safe surgery and the tumor out.
I'd like to thank all three, Miles, Spiros, Mike, very much for their attendance today.